India is being referred to as the next global superpower. With significant economic growth, India has become a sought-after international partner. So what's behind India's growth story? Narendra Modi has been in power for the last 10 years, and he seems to be on course to win a third consecutive term as the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. Modi aims to modernize India and turn it into a significant geopolitical player. He is skillfully navigating between the major power blocs and positioning India as the voice of the global south. So today on To The Point, we are discussing, is India under Modi an underrated superpower? Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Isha Bhatia-Sanan here in Berlin, and today my guests are Walter J. Lindner. He is an ex-German diplomat. He was ambassador of Germany to India from 2019 to 2022. Joel Sandhu is head of global dialogue and facilitation at the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPi, in Berlin. And joining us via Skype from Hamburg, we have Miriam Friis Hansen. She is lead research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining. Walter, you have a long-standing relationship with India. You went there as a 21-year-old to discover the country, to discover yourself, and then you retired as ambassador. Now, you've seen India from 1970s to 2020s. How has India changed?
Well, as a lot of things in India, everything is true and the contrary is also true. So it has not changed at all, and it has changed completely. Now, it has changed completely because, of course, it's now a modern state. You don't see the elephants on the streets anymore, and you have skyscrapers everywhere. If you go to Mumbai, this is a different world now. Everywhere, the cars are modern. So it is. Nothing reminds you on the India of 50 years ago. But if you look deeper, and then you see to the rituals, you see to the culture, 7,000 years, in comparison to 7,000 years, what is 40 or 50 years? Nothing. So you have the rituals, you have the temples, you have the mosques, you have all the cultural insignia, and so this is all still the same. If you go to rural India, you find the India which you have seen 50 years ago or maybe 200 years ago.
So modern India with traditional values. Now, you're not only an ex-diplomat, you're also a musician, you're also an author, and you've written a book in German, and if I may take the liberty to loosely translate, it says, "The Old West and the New South, what we should learn from India before it is too late." What should the West learn from India?
Well, there are a lot of points, of course. One is to see that Europe and the West is not the rest of the world. It is 20% of the world, and 80% of the world are global South countries. So when we had, very often we look too much into a Eurocentric way, German-centric way, and think this is what the rest of the world has to think. No, it is not, because there are other points of view in the rest of the world. So this is, you see a more globalized world with Indians. Indians have other Indians living in other countries. In most of the countries of the world, maybe in 190 countries, you have a diaspora, an Indian diaspora. Then, of course, digitalization. Then a young generation, 50% are under 35, and then you have the risk-taking entrepreneurships, innovation, Jugaad, which is something typical in India also. So there are a lot of things which we can learn from India, and most of all, we should dedicate more time and should listen to India.
Thank you. Let's go to Miriam. Miriam, Walter just gave us a glimpse of how India has changed in the last 5 decades. Now, if you could specifically tell us how India has changed in the last 1 decade under Modi, could you paint us a picture?
Okay, I fully agree that there's a lot of continuity going on. With my focus on sort of India's foreign policy and India's global stature, I think the ambition to play, and I think this is a quote from a Ministry of External Affairs report, to play the rightful place, receive the rightful place on the world stage. I think what has changed significantly is that India is now very close to this sort of self-defined global role. And I think Modi and his sort of very ambitious international outlook on India's global position, I think has contributed a lot to that. So I think whereas India has always been on the way of sort of reaching global stature, of having a extremely important and recognized global position, has always been there. I think it's never been closer to actually achieving this.
Now, you've co-authored a report called India After 2024 Elections, and Modi seems set to win this election. So
yeah,
what do you think is going to change in the next 5 years under Modi?
I would expect not too much to change. I think that the challenges are mainly sort of domestically, they're mainly at keeping up sort of the economic development and the economic growth at the level that India needs to be to achieve some of its goals. I mean, there's been calculations that in order to reach the size of market and the size of the economy that is aspire to, India needs growth rates of 10%. And I think that's a massive challenge. So I think there will be probably more, there is very likely to be more engagement, more reform in this sector. I think in terms of, again, foreign policy, I think India is doing a very good job at the moment to go for its own interests in a way. So I do not expect too much change, but more continuity on that front.
Joel, do you see any change in the next 5 years?
I think the big thing for the Modi government will be to really keep up this promise of, making India a developed country by 2047. The economy is growing at a 7% GDP growth rate, which is very admirable. And it's set to leapfrog Germany and Japan if it continues that to third position behind the US and China. And so I think the economy and ensuring that job creation is there, because it has, on average, 8 million people going to the labor market. They need jobs to make it competitive, and to also finding ways to continue not only economic growth, but counterbalance the different security challenges that it has in the region, and making sure it engages with partners across the globe, while at the same time protecting its own national interests, which is economic development. So I think the big hurdle will be to continue this. And I think that will be the biggest challenge for the government.
We'll continue talking about the economy. Meanwhile, voting is underway in India, and opinion polls suggest an easy victory for Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. So why doesn't Modi have to worry about any opposition in the election? It seems to boil down to the often repeated phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," but also to Modi's identity politics.
Hindus first. That's the ideology being used by Prime Minister Modi to govern the world's largest democracy. And it's making him popular. Around 80% of Indians are Hindus. Minorities and opposition members, on the other hand, have reported instances of intimidation. Modi is popular because he has invested heavily in infrastructure and launched social programs. During his 10 years of leadership, India has gone from 10th to the world's 5th largest economic power, surpassing its former colonial ruler, Great Britain. India also wants to overtake Germany and Japan by the end of the decade. Other high-profile successes, like the 2023 moon landing, only underscores India's ambitions to become a high-technology nation. And yet, poverty is still a visible problem in a country of approximately 1.4 billion people. With an average annual per capita income of around $2,400, India barely out-earns Nicaragua. Demographics, democracy, and diversity. From Modi's point of view, this trifecta is responsible for India's meteoric rise. Is India on its way to becoming a superpower?
Let's go to Miriam and understand what is a superpower exactly. Everyone's talking about India being the next superpower, but what does that mean?
Well, I think it's hard going to be talking about superpowers in the current international systems. I think we're going to talk about several great powers or poles in a sort of multipolar system. But I do think, I mean, very concretely, it means for India likely a seat in the UN Security Council, for example. It means to play, and I think that's playing to India's strength, to not having to decide for one or the other, for China or the United States. I think that's one particular sort of power that India at the moment exposes. And I think it's sort of not being able to be overlooked in important sort of world political decision making, be it climate change, be it whatever resolution to the Ukraine crisis, be it sort of the next pandemic. So not to be overlooked and to be considered and to actually not only be considered, but to shape sort of the rules and norms that are going to structure the solution of sort of global challenges.
So,
I think that
so considering all of that,
up.
in your opinion, is India on the right path? Is India on its way to becoming a superpower?
Yes, I do think that India is going to have to be considered in all of these issues. I mean, if we're looking to climate change, the Paris goals cannot be achieved without sort of Indian action on climate change, for example. India does have to watch out that its rising conflict and tensions with China are not distracting it too much from that path. But I do think overall now is the sort of Indian moment in these sort of times of polarization and conflict where it can play this sort of independent foreign policy out to its own strength.
Right. Joel, when we talk about superpower, economy plays a major role. And you were talking about economy earlier. Now, there are these two extremes. You have rising economy. The infrastructure is getting better. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Whoever's been to India recently would say that the airports are better. There are more highways, there are more railways, etc. But poverty and unemployment, they remain big issues. How does that go hand in hand?
Look, I mean, India and Indians have ambitions and aspirations, right? India is being courted by countries all over the world. It says, you know, it's the voice of the global south. It has an economy that is the 5th largest in the world, but at the same time, it has a wealth gap that is tremendous, and it's got one of the largest income discrepancies in the world between those who are really wealthy and those who are really poor. But you have to keep in mind that the Indian government has to do a balancing act. On the one hand, it's trying to grow an economy, but it also has to, it's responsible for 1.4 billion people in its country, and it's not going to happen overnight. This will take time, and India is one of the world's largest democracies. It's one of the messiest democracies, and you know, it's not going to just happen from one day to another. It's not going to happen within a decade. It'll take decades. So I do question if India is on its path to becoming a superpower in the most traditional sense, right? Like if you talk about the US hegemony decades ago, I think that world is behind us. But India is an important power. It's an influential power, and its voice matters, and it will increasingly matter as we move forward.
But I ask this because it's a little counterintuitive that the economy is rising, and yet the Indian economy is not able to generate employment for such a big youth.
It does generate employment, and the government will tell you that it has generated employment. But the issue, and critics, what they say is that the employment is in low-paid jobs, in agriculture, in jobs that are involving day jobs. Where much of it gets unpaid. For example, women do a lot of unpaid care work. So it's not that the jobs are not there, but they're not necessarily the jobs that the youth and people coming out of university want, because it's not being generated as quickly as 8 million people enter the workforce annually. That's a challenge for any government.
So surveys show that youth unemployment is one of the biggest issues in this election. Despite that, Modi remains extremely popular, and especially amongst the youth. How do you explain that popularity?
Well, I guess there are several reasons, of course. One is, I mean, he has won twice a landslide victory. You can't win a landslide victory in the world's biggest democracy without being popular. So something along the way he must have done right, that people go out and vote for him in such a massive way. Second, there must also be something in the records which he leaves behind: economic reforms, job creation, self-confidence building, and other things which are positive to the voters. Thirdly, I think, of course, the concentration on his person and his PR machinery around him is also makes him a pop star with followers like Barack Obama, I guess, and pop stars. So there are a lot of reasons, and of course also maybe one of the reasons is The critics say he's the Hinduization of the country. Positively said is raising the self-confidence and awareness of Indians that they have a 7,000-year-old unique culture. Of course, critics say this is shrinking spaces for civil society, whatever. But this the voter will decide. But I think there are a lot of reasons, and after all, he has also a kind of a background which is a very humble family background and this kind of ascetic lifestyle, while maybe others in the opposition don't have this. And then he has also had an opposition which was for a long time not really sure, should they go for elections and who should be the candidate. So this was also a factor which helped him.
I agree with most of what the ambassador said, but I would respectfully also challenge this notion of why he's so popular. It's not just because of everything you said, but the critics have said that he has glowing mainstream media coverage at the expense of suppressing press freedom on the other hand. Opposition leaders have their finances frozen in the banks, so it hampers campaign financing. And you also have opposition leaders who are imprisoned on anti-corruption charges shortly before the run-up to the election. So when you close down these spaces, it's not too difficult to become the main voice that people see, people hear. I give it to you that he's done a fantastic job with social media since 2014 elections when he first came on. He really capitalized. But let's not paint an overly rosy picture. I think there's still a lot to be scrutinized in that space.
Yeah, if I may, and that's one
Yes,
in terms of landslide. I mean, we have a sort of first past the post election system where like 42% give you a vast majority in the parliament. So I think sort of the landslide also is sort of an effect of the voting system, and you have sort of more than half not voting for Modi as well.
Mm-hmm.
Miriam, if you could follow the report that we just played in the studio. Now, Modi stresses the importance of democracy, and diversity. Now, with everything that Joel has also said, critics say that democracy and diversity is exactly what is under threat under Modi, and that's what he is advertising, that, this is what we need. Even in your report, you have mentioned India as, and I quote, ever less democratic country. Now, Modi is also seen as a dictatorial figure in the West. I would like to understand, for someone who's that authoritative, how is it that we talk about landslide victories and that he's going to get a majority? How is it that so many people want to vote for someone who is such a dictatorial personality?
Well, I think I would be a little bit careful with dictatorial, but what has just been said, I think that encroachment on democratic freedoms has been very tangible. But at the same time, I think Modi has managed to pick up a sentiment that has always been there, sort of the nationalistic, Hindu-focused sentiment that has always been there. In preparation of today, I've read about a poll where in 2009, 74% of a survey said that India should be very proud of itself and has a better system than most other places, something along the lines, and that has not shifted. That was sort of 74% in 2009, and in 2019 it was still over 70%. So I think he manages to pick up the sentiment very much, while at the same time sort of utilizing possibly somewhat anti-democratic means to enhance his brand and his grasps also on society.
Right. And Western countries have also expressed concerns about this, but at the same time, they also want to strengthen their ties with India, independent of its democratic record. Meanwhile, India's foreign policy is based on the principle of non-alignment. Whether it's the Russia-Ukraine war or the Gaza conflict, India under Modi has decided not to take any sides. Let's take a look at how India is navigating between the various power blocs.
Indian Prime Minister Modi received a standing ovation when visiting U.S. Congress in summer 2023, where he was celebrated as a champion of democratic values.
Toast to our partnership, to our people, to the possibilities that lie ahead, to two great friends, two great nations, and two great powers.
Western democracies are courting Modi, partly because they see India as a strategic geopolitical alternative to the increasingly aggressive China. But India has its own objectives. It has not clearly condemned Putin's war against Ukraine, and it continues buying oil and weapons from Russia. Modi presents himself as a confident spokesman for many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, countries for whom Europe's problems feel more distant. He said this: "Today, India is the voice of the global South." What foreign policy interests is India pursuing under Modi?
Walter, how do you explain Modi's foreign policy?
I think he has a very skillful foreign minister. That's one of the points which is, I think, a big asset of the India of today. Very skillfully, what Miriam said and what others said, he is maneuvering among all these big power interests, and he's doing a great job in making clear that India is not willing to follow the decisions of any bloc somewhere where some nations gather together and think they can make decisions for the rest of the world. These times are past and gone, and I think he's very right doing so. If you see 20% of the world is European and the rest is not European, so why should 20% per script how the rest of the world should live? So I think there he has done a good job, but of course it's backed by Prime Minister Modi. So this kind of maneuvering among different interests, where do you find these days a big country, which has good relationship to Israel and to the Palestinians and to Ukraine, who was just there, the president, and to Russia and to the US and even to China, where there's a kind of a pragmatic way of dealing with it. So to do this, I think you have to be skillful, and I think this is something which we will need in the future more, because you need countries like them, like India, which could, I would not say mediate, but who would be there to balance international interests in the 21st century.
Joel, there are a lot of terms that have come up in the so-called Modi era, like Modi has the vision to make India the Vishwaguru, the champion of the world, the leader of the world. And India is the Vishwamitra, the friend of the world. How does this friend walk the tightrope with East and West, the two ends?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would also question whether non-alignment still really exists, because what I see is India is moving slowly from non-alignment to multi-alignment. And what I mean by that is look at its security blocs and other blocs that it's part of. If you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's a security bloc. It's working alongside China and Russia. If you look at BRICS, it's again working alongside Russia and China. But then if you look at the Quad, it's working with the US, which has long contentious relationships with both Russia and China. So I think India is, and the Indian government is very carefully maneuvering this balance between, on the one hand, becoming more open economically and security-wise, but it has to balance this with also political economic realities at home. And it's willing to work with other countries that maybe it didn't get along with too well in the past, so long as it's pushing forward India's agenda, which is economic development. And that is the main balancing act there.
Let's go to Miriam before we close the show. Miriam, we don't have a lot of time, but as you saw in the report, Modi claims that India today is the voice of the global South. Now, India has border tensions with China. Relations with with Pakistan have gone from bad to worse. And we saw this diplomatic row with Maldives. So with all these tensions, how does India become the leader of the global South?
Well, I think that phrase has become very important to India, but I don't think it's that important possibly to the rest of the global South, which still is very good relations with China, for example. I do think that it's a good sort of marketing way of putting India even more on the map. But as said, I think as India has become more sort of transactional and pragmatic, I think other countries of the global South has as well. And so I think if interests align with India, great. If they align with China, great. So I think this sort of one voice for the global South is an illusion in this regard.
Thanks, Miriam. That's unfortunately all the time that we have. But I would still like to ask in one sentence, by when can we expect India to become the superpower?
Time will tell.
Walter?
It's already on a good way, so I think it's very close.
That's all the time we got. What do you think about it? Will India be the next superpower? If yes, by when? If you're watching us on YouTube, do let us know your thoughts. We'll be reading your comments. Thanks for your time. Goodbye.